For 22 years, Maria thought she was just cleaning a house. She had no idea the family she worked for was quietly building her a new life. On her final day, they handed her a single bank statement. The balance was $340,000. It was enough to buy the home she'd spent 2 decades renting. This is the story of a secret kept, a debt of gratitude, and the moment a life of quiet service was repaid with a single, life-changing act of grace. She was a cleaner, her husband, Antonio, a gardener. For over 2 decades, they served one family, dreaming of a home they could never afford. The Carters were wealthy, respected, but private. So how did a relationship built on professional silence lead to a secret worth $250,000? And why would a family choose to hide a fortune from the very woman they were giving it to for 22 long years? To understand the weight of that final gift, you have to understand the weight of the years that came before it. Maria and Antonio Rivera arrived in Connecticut in the spring of 2001 with 2 suitcases and a single goal: to build a life their children could inherit. They found work quickly through an agency. Antonio tending the expansive gardens of a pharmaceutical executive named Robert Carter, and Maria cleaning the 6,000-square-foot home where Robert lived with his wife, Elena, and their 2 young sons. The work was consistent, the pay was fair, but it was never enough to cross the line from renting to owning. Not in this market, not on their salaries. For 22 years, their routine was as fixed as the seasons. Maria arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 a.m. She dusted the grandfather clock in the foyer, polished the silver that was only used on holidays, and changed the linens in rooms that often went unused for weeks. She was quiet, thorough, and invisible in the way that good help often is to the wealthy. Antonio worked outside, shaping hedges, planting perennials, and keeping the tennis court clear of leaves. They saw each other mostly in passing, a quick lunch together at the small table in the garden shed, talking about their own children's report cards, their car troubles, the rising cost of everything. The Carters were not unkind. They were simply separate. Robert traveled constantly for mergers and board meetings. Elena chaired charity galas and planned summers in the Hamptons. Their world was one of quiet luxury and calculated distance. They gave Christmas bonuses, always in a crisp envelope. They offered hand-me-down furniture when they redecorated, but the line between employer and employee was a wall neither side attempted to scale. It was a professional relationship, built on reliability and discretion. And then in 2011, that wall developed its first crack. Antonio tore the meniscus in his knee while moving a heavy stone planter. The doctor said he needed surgery and he would be out of work for at least 8 weeks. No work meant no pay. The Rivera's emergency fund was a shallow thing, maybe enough for a month. They were staring down the loss of their apartment, the unraveling of everything they'd built. Maria, without telling Antonio, gathered every bit of courage she had and asked Elena Carter for an advance on her salary, just enough to cover 1 month's rent. Elena listened quietly from her chair in the sunroom. She didn't offer the advance. Instead, she wrote a personal check for the full amount of the rent and told Maria it was not a loan. "You have taken care of this home for 10 years, she said. "Let us help take care of you just this once." It was the first time Maria cried in that house. It was also the first time the Carters saw the Riveras not as staff, but as a family, fragile and trying to hold together. The surgery happened. Antonio recovered. Life returned to its routine, but something had shifted in the Carter home. Robert began to notice things. He noticed that Maria remembered his mother's favorite teacup and would set it out on the anniversary of her passing. He noticed Antonio had planted a small, struggling rose bush by the garden gate in memory of the Carters' old dog. They weren't just employees, they were archivists of the family's quiet history. And in 2013, Robert Carter made a decision he discussed with no one, not even Elena, for nearly a year. He called his estate lawyer, a meticulous man named David Finch. The request was unusual. Robert wanted to establish a revocable trust with a single anonymous beneficiary. He would fund it gradually with automatic transfers from a separate investment account. The terms were simple. The trust would grow untouched for years. It would only be revealed and delivered under 2 conditions: upon the beneficiary's voluntary retirement from his family's employ or upon his own death. The beneficiary's name was Maria Rivera. When he finally told Elena, she didn't hesitate. She insisted Antonio be included, so the Family Gratitude Trust, as David Finch labeled the file, was amended. From that point on, 2% of the annual returns from a specific Carter investment portfolio were diverted every quarter into two separate subtrusts, one for Maria, one for Antonio. It wasn't enough to notice missing from their wealth, but it was enough to accumulate, silently, like interest in the shadow of a giant. The Riveras had no clue. How could they? They were navigating their own real world, their eldest daughter's college tuition, the transmission that gave out on their minivan, the landlord who decided to sell their rental house out from under them in 2019, forcing a frantic, expensive move to a smaller, more expensive apartment. Through every crisis they worked. Maria polished the silver. Antonio pruned the roses. The dream of a down payment receding further with every passing year, a shoreline they could never quite reach. Meanwhile, in the Carters' world, a different pressure was building. Robert was diagnosed with a progressive heart condition. The travel slowed. The mergers were handed off to younger partners. He spent more time at home, in the spaces Maria cleaned and Antonio maintained. He watched them. He saw the weariness in Antonio's shoulders after a long day. He saw the way Maria looked at the photographs of the Carter children on the mantle, a look of both pride and a quiet, personal ache for the stability she couldn't give her own. In the spring of 2022, Robert Carter had a long meeting with David Finch and his financial advisor. He reviewed the balance of the Family Gratitude Trust. The numbers were substantial. He then gave two final, irrevocable instructions. First, he accelerated the funding. A large, one-time transfer was made. Second, he changed the triggering condition. The trust would now be revealed and delivered on the next major life milestone for the Riveras, their next move. Their next crisis, or barring that, on the day of Maria's 65th birthday, which was just 3 years away. Robert Carter passed away quietly in his sleep that following January. The family was bereft. The public memorial was filled with executives and philanthropists, but in the front row, off to the side, sat Maria and Antonio Rivera, invited personally by Elena. They grieved not for an employer, but for the man who, in ways they could never have imagined, had been watching over them. Elena was now alone in the big house. Her sons were grown, living in other states. The routine continued, but the heart of the home was gone. For Maria and Antonio, the work became an act of loyalty, a way to honor the man who had, in that one moment of their great need, simply written a check. They assumed that was the full measure of his generosity. They had no idea that his final, silent project was still ticking forward, a clock counting down to a day they couldn't see coming. And then, in the fall of 2023, the milestone arrived. It wasn't a crisis. It was a letter, a notice from their new landlord that the building was being converted to condominiums. They had 6 months to buy their unit or leave. It was the final door slamming on a decades-long dream. Defeated, Maria told Elena she would be retiring. She and Antonio were too old, she said, to start over renting again. They would move to a smaller town, find a cheap apartment, and figure it out. Elena Carter simply nodded and said she understood. She asked Maria to please come for one final cleaning to help her close up the house for the winter as a personal favor. Maria agreed. She arrived on a cold, bright Tuesday morning in November. She cleaned the house from top to bottom one last time. When she was finished, Elena asked her to sit down at the kitchen table. She placed a single sheet of paper in front of her. It was a bank statement. Maria looked at it, confused. Then she saw the account title, the Maria and Antonio Rivera Family Gratuity Trust, and then her eyes dropped to the balance. $340,127.16. Maria stared at the number until the digits swam on the page. Her mind refused the math. This was more than a decade of her salary. This was a house. This was the dream, printed on a single sheet of paper held by a woman she'd called Mrs. Carter for 22 years. She looked up, her voice a dry whisper. What is this? Elena Carter's eyes were soft, but her words were firm. It's yours, Maria, yours and Antonio. Robert set it up for you a long time ago. She slid a second document across the table. It was the trust agreement signed by Robert Carter and David Finch, dated back to 2013. Maria's name was on it. Antonio's name was on it. The purpose clause was simple. in stark legal language, to provide for the long-term security and housing needs of the named beneficiaries in recognition of their dedicated service and integral role within the grantor's family. Maria began to shake, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her hands and radiated through her whole body. This wasn't a bonus. This wasn't a check for a month's rent. This was a life rebuilt in secret. Why was all she could manage. Elena reached out and covered Maria's trembling hand with her own. Because you showed up, every Tuesday, every Thursday, through blizzards and birthdays and our own chaos. You cared for this home like it was your own. You remembered the things we forgot. Robert saw that. We both did. And we decided that your loyalty shouldn't just end with a pension you don't have. It should end with the security you've earned. Maria drove home in a trance. The bank statement sat on the passenger seat, a physical object with radioactive weight. She didn't go to her apartment. She drove straight to the community garden where Antonio was volunteering that afternoon. She found him kneeling in the dirt, patting soil around a young kale plant. He looked up, smiled, and then the smile vanished. Maria, what's wrong? Did something happen with Mrs. Carter? She couldn't speak. She just handed him the paper. Antonio wiped his hands on his jeans, took it, and squinted in the afternoon light. He was silent for a full minute. His lips moved as he read the number, then read it again. He looked at her, his face blank with disbelief. This is a mistake. This is someone else's account. It has our names on it, Tony. Our names. He did this. Mr. Carter did this for us. And then, in the middle of a public garden, surrounded by the earthy smell of compost and growth, Maria Rivera finally broke. 22 years of early mornings, of sore knees, of budgeting anxiety, of dreaming of a front door that was hers, all of it collapsed into a wave of shuddering, grateful sobs. Antonio held her, the paper crumpled gently in his dirt-stained hand, his own tears falling silently into her hair. The dream hadn't died. It had been growing in the dark, and it had just broken the surface. That night in their small, rented apartment, they spread the documents on the kitchen table. The bank statement, the trust summary from David Finch's office. They called their children, their voices cracking as they tried to explain the unexplainable. There was crying, shouting, disbelief, and then a profound, echoing silence on the other end of the line. Their daughter, a paralegal, was the first to ask the hard question. What about the taxes, Mom? A gift this big from an employer. The IRS will want their share, a huge share. It was a bucket of cold reality. The research from Part 1 was about to become their personal nightmare. Under standard tax law, any payment from an employer to an employee is considered compensation. It's taxable income. At that amount, the federal and state tax bill could be over $100,000. It could gut the gift, leaving them with enough for a down payment, but not for the house. The dream, once again, slipping through their fingers. The next morning, with panic setting in, Maria called Elena Carter. She stammered out the tax question, her voice thick with a new fear, the fear of a bill they could never pay. Elena listened calmly. Maria, stop worrying. David Finch has already taken care of all of that. You have a meeting with him tomorrow at 10. He will explain everything. David Finch's office was all dark wood and quiet efficiency. He was a man in his 60s, with the calm demeanor of someone who has navigated the rapids of great wealth for decades. He welcomed Maria and Antonio, not as former staff, but as clients. This, in itself, was a revelation. He poured them water and began. What Robert and Elena did is exceptionally rare, and it required very careful planning, he explained. The key was establishing that this was not compensation for services. It was a personal gift, born out of a relationship that existed outside of your employment. He opened a file. We documented everything. The advance for Antonio's surgery in 2011, that was the first evidence of a personal, familial dynamic. We kept records of your inclusion in family events after that. The Christmas dinners you were invited to, not as staff, but as guests. The personal birthday cards exchanged. We built a paper trail showing a genuine, affectionate relationship that transcended the employer-employee dynamic. He tapped a key paragraph in the trust document. This language was reviewed by 3 separate tax attorneys. It frames the gift as stemming from detached and disinterested generosity and affection, respect, and admiration, the exact language from the Duberstein court case that defines a tax-free gift. The IRS looks at intent. Robert's intent, documented in his instructions to me, was clear. This was a thank you, not a bonus. Antonio leaned forward. So, no taxes. David Finch allowed a small smile. That is the position we have taken. The trust was structured as a grantor trust for tax purposes during Robert's life, with him paying the taxes on its growth annually, which he did. The transfer of the corpus, the principal, to you is now being treated as a fulfillment of a bequest of a personal gift. You will receive a 1099 form, not a W-2. You should still consult with your own accountant, but we are prepared to defend this position vigorously should the IRS ever ask, and we do not expect them to. The case law is on our side. The relief that washed over Maria and Antonio was physical, like stepping out of a crushing weight. The gift was whole, it was real, but as they left the office, clutching a packet of instructions for claiming the funds, a new, subtle tension began to weave itself into their joy. This secret had been kept from them for a decade. What other secrets were tied to it? The answer came from an unexpected direction. The Carters' eldest son, Michael. A week after the revelation, he called Maria. His tone was polite but cool. He asked how she was doing, made small talk, and then casually mentioned that the family was so pleased everything had worked out. Dad was always so generous, Michael said, but you know, managing an estate is complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. Mom's been a bit overwhelmed. It was a veiled message, a soft probe. Maria, with her hardened sensitivity to the moods of the household, heard it clearly. There was a question hanging in the silence. Did you expect this? Do you think you're entitled to more? The unspoken tension reframed everything. This act of supreme generosity might not have been unanimously celebrated behind the closed doors of the Carter family. Perhaps Robert's quiet project hadn't been fully understood or approved by the next generation. This pivot changed the emotional landscape. The gift was no longer just a beautiful secret between two couples. It was a transaction that had ripple effects in another family's dynamics. Were the Carter children resentful? Did they see this as their inheritance being given away? The purity of the gesture was now shadowed by complex human emotions on the other side. Driven by this new anxiety, Maria and Antonio did something they had never dared to do before. They went to an open house. Not just any house. The very condo unit they were being forced to vacate. The one their landlord was selling for $375,000. Walking through the familiar rooms with a real estate agent, no longer as tenants, but as potential buyers, was a surreal, out-of-body experience. Antonio stood in the small backyard, the place he'd grown tomatoes for years, and whispered, "We could own this dirt." But the process was a minefield. Their credit was good, but not exceptional. Their income history was steady, but modest. A mortgage lender looked at their application, saw the sudden, massive deposit about to hit their account, and flagged it immediately. "Large, undocumented gift," the processor said. "We need a paper trail from the donor, letters of explanation, proof it's not a loan." They were thrust back into the world of David Finch, of legal affidavits, of having to prove the provenance of their miracle. Elena Carter, without being asked, provided everything. She wrote a personal letter to the mortgage company on her personal stationery, affirming the gift. David Finch provided a sworn letter detailing the trust's history. The process inched forward, but each request for more documentation felt like an interrogation, a challenge to the legitimacy of their good fortune. The system, it seemed, was not designed for stories like theirs. And then the bridge to the next crisis appeared. It came in the form of a letter from their current landlord's attorney, not about the sale, about the condition of the property. It cited potential unauthorized modifications to the garden plot and wear and tear beyond normal on the kitchen flooring. It was a flimsy, aggressive tactic, a common ploy to try and withhold a security deposit from tenants on their way out. But for Maria and Antonio, who had maintained the home flawlessly for years, it felt like a targeted insult, a final attempt to chip away at them on their way to freedom. Antonio wanted to fight it. Maria, exhausted, just wanted it to go away. It was a small sum in the face of their new wealth, but it was a symbol. The world of landlords and scraping by wasn't letting go without a petty, last-minute struggle. As they argued about it quietly at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd first seen the bank statement, a deeper tension surfaced. For the first time, they were arguing about money. Not about not having it, but about how to use it, how to fight for it, what it meant. The windfall was supposed to bring peace, but it had become a new kind of pressure, exposing cracks in their own unified front. Antonio saw every challenge as a battle to be won, to prove they deserved this. Maria saw each one as a threat to the fragile miracle, something to be smoothed over. The weight of the secret, now revealed, was transforming into the weight of sudden visibility, of scrutiny, of becoming people who had to explain a $340,000 answer to a $375,000 question. And in the middle of this private storm, a public one was brewing. Elena Carter, perhaps wanting to share a story of goodness in a cynical world, mentioned the gesture briefly to a friend at a charity committee meeting. She did not use names, but the story was too perfect, too resonant. It began to travel. A local lifestyle blogger caught wind of it. A reporter from the Hartford Courant made a call to David Finch's office, asking for confirmation. The wall of privacy that had protected the Riveras for 22 years was about to be torn down by the very thing they had been given, a headline. David Finch's office did not confirm the story, but in the age of the internet, a non-denial is a kind of fuel. The reporter, a young woman named Chloe with a focus on feel-good local news, dug deeper. She called the property management company for the Rivera's apartment building. She called the local garden center where Antonio volunteered. She was piecing together a puzzle whose subjects had no idea they were in the frame. The first Maria and Antonio knew of it was when a Facebook post from a local community group appeared on their daughter's feed. The headline was, "Secret Millionaire's Gift to Faithful Housekeeper." It was vague, but it named the town, described the wealthy pharmaceutical family, and mentioned a life-changing trust fund. The comments were already exploding, hundreds of them. Some were heart emojis and faith in humanity restored, but others were darker. Must be nice. What did she have to do for that money? That's their kids' inheritance gone. The private gift was becoming public property, and everyone had an opinion. Elena Carter called Maria, her voice strained with regret. "I am so sorry, Maria. I mentioned it in confidence. I never thought." Maria, feeling a strange need to comfort her former employer, assured her it was okay, but it was. That evening, a van from a local TV station parked at the end of their street. No one knocked, but the presence was a spotlight. They drew the blinds and felt like fugitives in their own home. Then the article dropped. The Hartford Courant's online edition. It had the headline, "A Legacy of Quiet Thanks, Retired Couple Gifted Home Down Payment After Decades of Service." It used their names. It quoted a source close to the Carter family, likely Michael. The tone suggested a respectful distance. It detailed the trust, the amount, and the tax strategy. It was accurate, and because it was accurate, it was utterly exposing. The fallout was immediate and multidirectional. For Maria and Antonio, their phone became a brick of buzzing anxiety. Calls from long-lost relatives, from charities, from financial advisors smelling a commission. A GoFundMe page was started for them by a complete stranger, which they had to frantically get taken down. Their quiet life was replaced by a cacophony of want and judgment. Antonio stopped going to the garden center, too wary of sidelong glances and questions. For the Carters, the publicity acted as a catalyst, forcing private tensions into the open. Michael Carter gave a brief, formal quote to the paper about his father's generosity, but behind the scenes, as the Riveras learned through the strained tone of Elena's next call, there was a family argument. Michael and his brother were not angry about the money itself, Elena explained. They were angry about the secrecy. They felt blindsided, their father's financial planning kept from them. The gift, meant to be a pure act, was now a wedge in the Carter family, a symbol of their father's opaque decisions. The Riveras' joy was now inextricably linked to another family's pain. There was no clean happiness. And then the wait, it gets worse moment arrived. It came in a plain manila envelope with no return address, delivered to their apartment. Inside were printouts of online comments from a financial forum, a thread titled, "IRS Audit Incoming." Speculators, armchair tax experts, were dissecting the Courant article. They argued that David Finch's strategy was aggressive, that the IRS would absolutely challenge a gift of this size, that the personal relationship defense was flimsy for Livent staff. One comment, highlighted in yellow marker by whoever sent the envelope, read, "They'll get a CP 2000 notice within 18 months. Guaranteed. The tax and penalties will claw back half. It's not a gift, it's a loan from the government. The anonymous cruelty of it was a masterstroke of psychological terror. The foundational security David Finch had promised, the case law is in their minds, replaced by a looming specter of a six-figure debt to the federal government. The trust fund was no longer a safe harbor, it was a target painted on their backs. Panicked, Antonio insisted they call David Finch again. The lawyer was patient but firm. He assured them the anonymous forum posts were nonsense, that the trust was bulletproof, but the seed of doubt was planted, and it grew a twisted vine of anxiety that choked their sleep. They started talking about only using half the money, saving the rest for the tax bill. The dream began to shrink again, this time from the inside, from fear. This internal pressure cracked open the first real conflict in their marriage in years. The condo closing was scheduled. The mortgage was approved, contingent on the gift funds. Antonio, influenced by the fear and his newfound defensive posture, wanted to walk away. Let's just take the money, pay off all our debts, rent a nicer place, and have a cushion. No risk, no mortgage, no IIS target. Maria, however, had seen the bank statement. She had felt the weight of the secret in Alina's kitchen. To her, buying the house wasn't just a financial decision, it was fulfilling the unspoken promise of the gift. It was honoring Robert Carter's intent. He didn't give us this money to just pay off our credit cards, Tony. He gave it to us for a home, our home. They were at an impasse, the money a wall between them instead of a bridge. The stress manifested in bizarre ways. Antonio became obsessed with checking their credit report for signs of fraud. Maria started cleaning their small apartment with a furious, unnecessary intensity. The gift was supposed to solve problems. Instead, it had become the only problem. It was their daughter, the paralegal, who staged the intervention. She drove up one weekend, sat them down, and spoke with blunt, loving force. "Mom, Dad, stop. You are letting strangers on the internet and your own fear steal this from you. The lawyer says it's okay. The money is in your account. The house is waiting. What are you doing?" She looked at Antonio. "Dad, you've spent your whole life being cautious because you had to be. You don't have to be anymore." She looked at Maria. "Mom, you want to honor Mr. Carter, then use the gift the way it was intended. Live in a home you own. He wanted to see that. I know he did." Her words were a splash of cold, clear water. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, saw the fear and exhaustion in each other's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, they saw past it. They saw the couple who had survived for 22 years on hard work and mutual support. Antonio reached across the table and took Maria's hand. He nodded just once. The decision was made. They would buy the house. The closing was set for a Friday morning, but the world had one more twist to offer, a revelation that would change the interpretation of everything that came before. The night before the signing, Alina Carter asked to visit them at their apartment. It was an unprecedented request. She arrived alone, looking older and more fragile than Maria had ever seen her. She sat on their worn sofa and clasped her hands tightly. "There's something Robert asked me to give you," she said, her voice quiet, "but only when the transaction was complete, when the home was truly yours." She handed Maria a small, sealed envelope. On the front, in Robert Carter's distinctive, slanted handwriting, it read, "For Maria and Antonio, for the key." With trembling fingers, Maria opened it. Inside was a single sheet of personal stationery. The letter was short. "Maria Antonio, asterisk. If you are reading this, you have used the trust for its purpose. You have a home, that was the first goal. The trust was the method. But a method is just a tool. The reason was simpler. For years, you cared for the physical structure of our family's life. You maintained the vessel. In return, I wanted to help you secure your own, not out of charity, but out of recognition. You are builders too. You built a life of dignity and love within constraints that would have broken others. That is a rarer and more valuable thing than any stock portfolio. The money is not a payment for service. It is an investment in continuation, in stability, in the kind of quiet, enduring legacy that doesn't make headlines but makes a life. Live well in your home. Fill it with the same care you gave to ours. With great respect, asterisk. Robert." Maria read it aloud, her voice breaking on every syllable. Antonio bowed his head, a single tear tracing a clean line through the dust of a long-forgotten worry on his cheek. This was the missing piece. The legal documents were the skeleton, but this letter was the heart. It reframed everything. This wasn't a generous employer or a shrewd tax strategy. This was one man seeing two others and acknowledging a shared value, the sacred work of building something that lasts. The noise of the media, the family tension, the tax fears, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. The core of the story was this: a silent witness had broken his silence in the only way that mattered. Elena watched them, her own eyes glistening. He wrote that the night after we amended the trust to include Antonio, she said, he was so pleased with himself, not for the money, but for the precision of it, for getting it right. The following morning, under the sterile lights of a title company office, Maria and Antonio Rivera signed approximately 100 documents. Their hands were steady. When the agent handed Antonio the keys, two cold, brass copies on a simple ring, he held them in his palm as if weighing them. They drove directly to the condo, their car now followed by a single, respectful reporter and photographer from the Courant, allowed at Elena's discreet arrangement to capture the final, positive beat of the story. They stood on the front step of the building they had lived in for years, but this time, Antonio slid the key into the lock of their own unit's front door. It turned with a solid, satisfying asterisk thunk that echoed through the empty hallway. He pushed the door open, stepped back, and gestured for Maria to enter first. She crossed the threshold and stopped. She wasn't looking at the familiar living room. She was feeling the space beneath her feet, the walls around her, the air in the hallway. It was the same space, but it was entirely new. It was theirs. A silent pact kept for a decade had finally been fulfilled. The long, quiet work of two lives had been met at the finish line with a single, resonant act of seeing. Antonio stepped in beside her and closed the door. The lock clicked, shutting out the world, the noise, the fear, the past. For a long moment, they stood in the silence of their own home. The journey of the gift was over. The life it was meant for was just beginning. The first night in their home, they slept on an air mattress in the middle of the living room floor. Not because they didn't have a bed, but because they wanted to feel the new emptiness, the spacious silence of ownership. There were no landlord's footsteps above, no pending rent check, no notice taped to the door. There was just the quiet hum of a refrigerator that cooled their own food in their own kitchen. Antonio lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling he now owned a fraction of every month with his mortgage payment. "It feels different," he whispered into the dark. Maria, already half asleep, smiled. "It's the sound of the door being closed," she said, "from the outside." The newspaper article, once a source of anxiety, became a strange artifact of their old life. The local attention faded within a week, replaced by the next story. But the story left a permanent, positive residue. Their neighbors, who had read the piece, now waved with genuine warmth. The manager at the local hardware store, when Antonio went to buy new locks, refused to let him pay. "Your story made my mom cry," the young man said, shrugging. "Just take them." Small human kindnesses began to echo the large one they'd received. The world, they found, was not just full of scrutiny and envy. It was also full of people moved to their own small acts of recognition. The money itself, after the down payment and closing costs, left a substantial remainder. They followed David Finch's advice and met with a fee-only financial planner. They paid off their car, erased all consumer debt, and established a robust emergency fund for the first time in their lives. The remainder was invested conservatively. The goal was not to get rich, it was to make the security permanent. The planner called it the Sleep at Night Fund. For Maria and Antonio, who had spent decades sleeping lightly with one ear tuned to financial worry, it was the deepest gift of all. Their relationship, strained during the crisis of publicity, recalibrated in the calm that followed. The arguments about money evaporated because the acute pressure was gone. They found themselves returning to older, simpler conversations about what vegetables to plant in their new backyard plot, about which wall to paint first. The gift had not just given them a house, it had given them back the mental space to be a couple, not just survival partners. But the story's ripple effects reached further than their own four walls. The Courant article was read by the director of the local Habitat for Humanity chapter. He reached out to Maria and Antonio with a proposition. Would they be willing to share their story, not about the money, but about the decades of work that preceded it. At a fundraiser for affordable housing, they agreed hesitantly. Standing before a modest crowd, Antonio spoke not of the Carters' check, but of the dignity of maintaining a home, any home. Maria spoke of the dream that sustains you through tired hands and sore knees. They raised a significant amount that night, not out of pity, but out of shared respect for the foundational dream of a place of your own. They had become, unintentionally, symbols of a deferred dream finally realized, a powerful narrative for a housing charity. The dynamic with the Carter family settled into a new, respectful distance. Elena sold the big house 6 months later and moved to a senior community near her sons. Before she left, she had Maria and Antonio over for one last tea. It was not in the sunroom, but in the mostly empty kitchen, boxes stacked in the corner. The goodbye was heartfelt, tinged with the melancholy of endings, but free of obligation. The transaction of the gift was complete. It had severed the tie of employment and replaced it with a fleeting, permanent bond of mutual gratitude. They promised to keep in touch, and they did, with a Christmas card each year, a brief update on grandchildren and gardens. A year to the day after they moved in, the final surprising detail emerged. It arrived in the mail, a formal letter from the law offices of Finch and Associates. David Finch was retiring. The letter was a standard notification that their trust file was being transferred to a successor attorney. Enclosed was a copy of the final accounting. Maria almost filed it away without looking, but Antonio, now the meticulous owner of his own affairs, sat down at their kitchen table to review it. He traced the columns of figures, the initial seed money, the quarterly contributions, the one-time acceleration after Robert's diagnosis. And then he saw it. A single-line item, dated the same month they had received the statement from Elena. It was a disbursement for $5,000. The payee was not Maria or Antonio Rivera. The payee was the Hartford Animal Shelter on Brainerd Road. The memo line read, "Designated charitable bequest per RC directive." Antonio called Maria over. They stared at the line. Robert Carter, in designing the trust, had not only provided for them, he had also included a directive that upon the successful transfer of the funds to the beneficiaries, a separate, smaller donation be made to Maria's favorite charity, the place where she had talked about volunteering once she retired. He had been listening, all those years, to more than just her work schedule. He had heard her wish to give back, and he had quietly built that into the architecture of his gift. The money wasn't just for them to take, it was for them to witness generosity extending beyond themselves, a final lesson in the continuum of care. Maria called the animal shelter. They confirmed the donation. They had received it with a note attributing it to the Rivera Carter Family Fund. The shelter manager said, "We wondered who that was, that paid for a whole spay and neuter clinic." In that moment, the gift expanded again. It was no longer a transaction between two couples. It was a stone dropped in a pond, and the ripples had just reached a new shore, helping animals Maria loved in a clinic she would never see. This became the true, quiet core of the payoff. The money changed their material life, absolutely, but the gesture asterisk, its secrecy, its specificity, its embedded kindness to a cause she loved, changed their understanding of the world. It taught them that loyalty is seen, that quiet work is a language some people can actually hear, and that the most profound thanks is not a party or a plaque, but a thoughtful, life-altering act that says, "I saw you, I saw your whole life." Today, Maria tends a small, thriving garden in her backyard. The tomatoes are the best Antonio says he's ever grown. She volunteers at that animal shelter every other Wednesday, cleaning cages and walking dogs, paying forward the gift in the currency of her own time. Antonio putters in a small shed fixing things for neighbors, his knee finally pain-free after a surgery he could now easily afford. Their children visit a home that is permanently theirs, a base camp for the next generation. The story of the $340,000 secret trust fund could end with the number, with the shocking reveal. But the real story, the one that lasts, is what happened after the check cleared. It's the story of a fear that dissolved, of a marriage that decompressed, of a simple door closing on uncertainty and locking shut. It's the proof that in an economy of attention and noise, the most powerful currency is sometimes silent, patient, and invested over 22 years, waiting for the exact right moment to say, "This was always meant for you." Robert Carter's final calculation wasn't financial. It was human. He measured their devotion not in hours worked, but in years of showing up. And he paid it back not with a bonus, but with a future. The ledger, after a lifetime, was settled not with a number, but with a key. Maria and Antonio Rivera turned that key, walked into their life, and finally, permanently, closed the door behind them. So what do we do with a story like this? In a world that often measures value in headlines and loud declarations, the story of Maria, Antonio, and the Carters exists in a different register entirely. It's a story calibrated to a quieter frequency. It asks us to consider the hidden ledgers in our own lives, the people whose labor forms the backdrop of our days, whose reliability we might mistake for simplicity. The true shock isn't the dollar amount, it's the timescale. Robert Carter didn't react in a moment of inspiration. He observed for years, and then he engineered a solution with the same patience with which it was earned. He understood that the most profound gratitude isn't always expressed in the moment, with a tip or a thank you note. Sometimes it's a seed planted in the soil of someone else's life, watered with silence, and left to grow until it's strong enough to bear the full weight of their dreams. This story challenges a cynical assumption that the worlds of wealth and service are separated by a one-way mirror where only one side is truly seen. Here, the mirror was two-way. Maria and Antonio saw the family's rhythms, their losses, their quiet moments, and Robert eventually chose to see back. He saw the dignity, the endurance, the unspoken dream. The money was just the tool he used to bridge a gap his words never could. For every story like this that surfaces, how many more exist, undisclosed, in the confidential files of estate lawyers? How many acts of quiet rebalancing happen in the shadows of great fortune, where loyalty is accounted for not as a business expense, but as a moral debt? We rarely hear about them because their power lies in their privacy, in their specificity to the people involved. The lingering question this documentary leaves us with isn't about money, it's about attention. Who in the architecture of your life is performing the quiet, essential maintenance? The person who fixes your car, teaches your child, delivers your mail, keeps your office clean. Are they just a function, or is there a life there, a story, a deferred hope? The Carters' story suggests that seeing that life, truly seeing it, is the first and most revolutionary act. The generosity is almost a secondary consequence. Maria and Antonio's new home is more than wood and brick. It is a physical manifesto, a statement that decades of showing up, of doing a simple thing well and with care, is a form of capital. A capital that, in the right eyes, appreciates. Their key is a testament to the idea that the world is not always a zero-sum game. Sometimes, it is a place where one person's gratitude can become another person's foundation. These are the stories we hunt for, the real, the raw, the narratives that reveal the hidden wiring of human connection. They remind us that for every act of betrayal that screams for our attention, there are countless acts of quiet faithfulness, and occasionally, a seismic act of recognition that whispers, "I saw what you built." If you want to hear more stories that operate on that deeper frequency, stories that go beyond the headline and into the heart, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and join our community. We have so many more real human stories to share with you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.